They built their dream mansion on MY land while I was overseas, thinking I'd never find out. But when the HOA refused to remove it, I discovered I owned something they desperately needed, their electricity rights. What would you do if you had the power to plunge your enemies into darkness? The letter from my grandfather's lawyer arrived on a rainy Tuesday. I tore open the envelope while standing in my tiny apartment kitchen, coffee dripping onto the counter. Inside was a deed to 10 acres of woodland I'd visited as a child but hadn't seen in years. "Holy cow!" I whispered, running my fingers over the official stamp. I own land. My boss wasn't happy when I requested time off, especially since I just accepted a 3-year contract for our company's overseas project in Japan. But I needed to see my inheritance before leaving. The drive to Pine Valley took 5 hours. I followed the GPS down winding roads until I reached a gravel path that disappeared into thick trees. A weathered sign read "Private Property" in my grandfather's handwriting. Beyond it stretched acres of untouched forest, bordered on one side by what looked like an upscale neighborhood called Maple Ridge Heights. I hiked through the woods, remembering summers spent building forts and catching frogs. Near the border with the fancy houses, I found the survey markers my grandfather had pointed out years ago, metal stakes hammered into the ground with bright orange caps. An older man was trimming hedges in a yard that backed up to the woods. He waved and I walked over. "Hi there," I said. "I just inherited this land from my grandfather." "You must be James Miller's grandson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Doug Williams. Your grandfather was a good man. Refused to sell this place 100 times over." "Sell to who?" Doug gestured toward the large houses. "Maple Ridge HOA's been trying to expand for years. They want to build more megahomes and a golf course." I frowned. "Well, I don't plan to sell either." Doug looked relieved. "Good to hear. Watch yourself, though. The HOA board doesn't take no for an answer. Especially not from Karen Thompson. She's been eyeing the part of your property that borders her backyard for years." "Which house is hers?" He pointed to a white mansion with columns. "The one with 3 luxury cars in the driveway. She's the vice president of the HOA and thinks she owns the world." 2 days later, I flew to Japan, leaving my property in the hands of a local management company that promised to check on it quarterly. Between the intense work schedule and the time difference, months passed between my calls home. Before I knew it, 3 years had gone by. When I finally returned, jet-lagged and eager to see my woodland, I found my access path blocked by a chain with a construction zone. No trespassing sign. Confused, I parked and hiked in through another route, following the sound of machinery. What I saw stopped me cold. A massive house frame stood in a freshly cleared area on what I was certain was my land. Workers were installing windows while landscapers shaped the barren dirt into what would become a backyard. A blonde woman in expensive sunglasses directed a truck where to dump decorative gravel. Something about her seemed familiar, though we'd never met. "Excuse me," I called out, approaching. "What's going on here?" She turned, looking annoyed at the interruption. "This is a private construction site." "On private property," I agreed. "My property." The woman's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose above her sunglasses. "And you are the owner of this land," I said, extending my hand. "And you must be Karen Thompson." Her smile vanished. "How do you know my name?" "Doug Williams mentioned you years ago. Said you'd been interested in expanding onto this property." She removed her sunglasses, revealing cold blue eyes. "This parcel was purchased legally from Maple Ridge Heights HOA 6 months ago. I have all the paperwork." "That's impossible. I never sold this land to anyone." Karen's laugh was like ice cracking. "The boundary lines were reassessed during your absence. This section was determined to be part of the Maple Ridge Heights common area, which was then sold to me for my dream home." She gestured to the half-built house. "As you can see, we're well underway." My stomach twisted. "This isn't right. These are my grandfather's woods." "Not anymore." She turned away, then paused. "If you have concerns, you can speak with our HOA president, Richard Hammond. But don't waste your time. We have excellent lawyers." I watched her walk away, typing furiously on her phone. Within minutes, a black SUV pulled up, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out. Karen pointed in my direction while talking rapidly. I retreated into the trees, my mind racing. Something very wrong had happened while I was away, and I needed to figure out exactly what. That night I couldn't sleep. I dug through boxes until I found my grandfather's original property maps and the deed with the precise GPS coordinates of the boundaries. Dawn was breaking when I finally called a surveyor, willing to pay extra for an emergency assessment. 3 days later, my worst fears were confirmed. Someone had moved the boundary markers about 200 feet into my property. Karen's dream home stood entirely on land that legally belonged to me. As I stared at the surveyor's report, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Maple Ridge HOA. "Hello," I answered. "This is Richard Hammond, president of Maple Ridge Heights Homeowners Association." His voice oozed fake charm. "I understand you're claiming ownership of the land where Mrs. Thompson's new residence is being constructed." "I'm not claiming anything. I have proof it's mine. Perhaps we should meet to discuss this unfortunate misunderstanding." "Fine," I agreed. "Tomorrow at noon. My cabin." As I hung up, a text message appeared from an unknown number. "Back off or things will get unpleasant. KT." I looked out my window toward the construction site, where lights now blazed despite the late hour. Workers were suddenly operating on an overnight schedule, the noise of their equipment echoing through the trees. This wasn't just about land anymore. This was war. At precisely noon, a convoy of 3 luxury vehicles crunched up my gravel driveway. Richard Hammond emerged first, tall, silver-haired, wearing a golf shirt with the Maple Ridge logo. Karen Thompson followed in stiletto heels that sank into the soft ground, making her wobble. A younger man in a suit carrying a leather briefcase completed their power trio. "Mr. Hammond," I said, not offering my hand. "Come in." My grandfather's cabin was small but solid. I'd spent the morning clearing away dust and setting up the dining table with the property documents, surveys, and deed. A pitcher of iced tea sat untouched as the 3 visitors surveyed my humble home with poorly disguised disgust. "This is Marcus Delgado, our attorney," Richard said. The lawyer nodded curtly. I got straight to the point. "You've built on my land without permission." Richard smiled, showing expensive veneers. "That's not accurate. The HOA commissioned a property assessment last year that showed this parcel had been incorrectly surveyed decades ago. The corrected boundary places Mrs. Thompson's home squarely within Maple Ridge Heights." "Interesting," I said, sliding across my grandfather's original survey and the new one I'd commissioned. "Because according to both of these, you're wrong." Karen sniffed. "Anyone can hire a surveyor to say whatever they want." "Including you," I replied. "The difference is, I have the original deed with GPS coordinates that match my survey exactly." The lawyer, who had been flipping through my documentation, whispered something to Richard, whose smile faltered slightly. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," Richard said. "These things happen with old properties. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement that satisfies everyone. I want construction stopped immediately and the partial structure removed from my land." Karen's face flushed red. "Absolutely not. We've already invested over $300,000. "In a house on stolen property," I replied calmly. "How dare you?" she snapped. "Do you have any idea who we are in this community? People who take what isn't theirs, apparently." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Hammond, Mrs. Thompson, perhaps we should discuss this privately before continuing." While they huddled by the window, I noticed Karen's husband pull up in yet another luxury car. He stayed outside, pacing and smoking. Richard approached again, his tone gentler. "Look, clearly there's been a mix-up. What if we compensate you for the acre where the house stands? We could offer well above market value." "I'm not interested in selling." "Everyone has a price," Karen interjected. "My grandfather turned down developers for 40 years. I plan to honor his wishes." Richard's friendly mask slipped. "This could become very unpleasant for you. Legal battles are expensive and time-consuming. So is rebuilding when you've put a house in the wrong place," I countered. The meeting ended in a stalemate. As they left, Karen's husband Michael approached me directly. He was shorter than I expected, with a permanent scowl. "You're making a big mistake," he growled. "We run this town." That night, the construction noise was deafening. Floodlights blazed until dawn, positioned to shine directly at my cabin. When the machinery finally stopped, leaf blowers started immediately, followed by the beeping of delivery trucks backing up. I called the police about the noise violation, but the officer who responded seemed uncomfortable. "Sorry, but Maple Ridge Heights has a special exemption for construction projects. There's nothing I can do." Later that day, I visited the county records office. The clerk, an older woman named Doris, remembered my grandfather fondly. "Those Maple Ridge folks have been trying to expand for years," she confided, "always finding loopholes and bending rules." I spent hours digging through faded maps and property records. Something wasn't adding up about the HOA's claim. Their corrected survey had appeared out of nowhere, conducted by a company I couldn't find any information about. When I asked Doris about it, she frowned. "That doesn't sound right. Any legitimate survey would be filed here. Can you check who requested boundary changes for my property?" She typed on her computer, then looked troubled. "According to this, your grandfather requested the change himself last year. That's impossible. He died 4 years ago." Doris's eyes widened. "Someone falsified documents." On my way home, I drove past Karen's construction site. The workers had seemingly doubled in number. At this pace, the house would be finished within weeks. I needed leverage, and fast. Back at the cabin, I found my tire had been slashed. A note under the windshield wiper read, "Accidents happen in the woods. Be careful." That night, I could barely sleep as cement trucks poured the foundation for Karen's pool at 2 a.m. When I finally dozed off, I was awakened by my phone ringing. "Hello," I mumbled. "It's Doug Williams from next door to your property. You need to come quick. They're cutting down the big oak grove." I threw on clothes and raced through the pre-dawn darkness. By the time I arrived, 3 ancient oaks lay on their sides, their massive trunks oozing sap from fresh cuts. "They showed up an hour ago," Doug said, pointing to a tree removal service. "Said they had permits to clear this section." I confronted the foreman, who showed me paperwork signed by Richard Hammond authorizing removal of hazardous trees on HOA property. "This isn't HOA property," I insisted. He shrugged. "Not my problem, buddy. I go where I'm told." I called my lawyer, who promised to file for an emergency injunction, but warned it might take days to process. By then, the damage would be done. As I watched helplessly, Karen drove up in her convertible. She stepped out, surveying the fallen trees with satisfaction. "Such a shame about these old trees," she said, not bothering to hide her smile. "Safety hazard, you know. But don't worry, we're planting new saplings. Eventually." "You know this is wrong," I said quietly. "What I know," she replied, her voice hardening, "is that you're standing in the way of progress. This sad little patch of woods was never going to stay wild forever. Maple Ridge needs to grow. Not on my land. We'll see about that." She checked her diamond-studded watch. "The county commissioners' meeting is this afternoon. Did you know the zoning board is voting on some interesting changes? You might want to attend." As she drove away, I realized I was facing not just Karen and Richard, but potentially an entire system they'd spent years influencing. I called Doug. "I need to know everything about Maple Ridge HOA. Who they know, who they pay, everything." "You're fighting an uphill battle," he warned. "They've got half the town in their pocket. Then I need to find something they want more than my land." I paused, watching another ancient oak crash to the ground. Something they can't live without. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the yellow document hidden in my grandfather's old lockbox. The county clerk had mentioned something odd about our family records, but I never expected this bombshell. My grandfather hadn't just owned the land, he had sold specific electrical easement rights to Maple Ridge Heights decades ago. "This can't be right," I whispered, rushing back to the county records office. "Mrs. Patel, the records keeper for 27 years, adjusted her glasses. Your grandfather was quite clever. He sold those rights to the power company but added a clause that they couldn't be transferred without first offering them to his heirs. And what happened to those rights now? I asked, heart racing. Sunbelt Power restructured in 2005. Those kinds of specialized local easements don't fit their new business model. They've been sitting in limbo, available for purchase. I spent 3 sleepless nights calculating risks. My retirement fund, savings, even my emergency cash, everything would be needed. Was it worth it? As Karen's construction crews cut down another row of 100-year-old oak trees on my property line at 6 a.m., I made my decision. The utility company representative looked shocked when I walked in. Nobody's shown interest in these particular rights for years. 6 hours and every penny of my savings later, I owned the electrical easement rights to Maple Ridge Heights. That same evening, a cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was an invitation to Karen's housewarming party, with a handwritten note, "Come see what progress looks like. Maybe you'll learn something." My lawyer advised against attending. Don't engage until we're ready to move. But I needed to see exactly what they'd built and how far onto my land it extended. Saturday evening arrived with perfect weather. Karen's new mansion blazed with light, visible from half a mile away. Cars lined the private road, including Richard Hammond's Bentley and Marcus Delgado's Tesla. I wore my only decent suit and walked in carrying an expensive bottle of champagne. Nobody recognized me at first. Karen's home was exactly what you'd expect. Everything oversized and overpriced. Marble countertops thick as books. Chandeliers that probably cost more than my car. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing the woods, my woods. There he is. Karen's voice cut through the party chatter. Our stubborn neighbor finally joins civilization. Guests turned, cocktails in hand, curious about the conflict they'd heard whispers of. Beautiful home, I said, meaning it, especially the back patio that extends 30 feet onto my property. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Karen's smile tightened. Let me show you the view everyone's talking about. She steered me toward the back, where massive glass doors opened to an elaborate patio. Fire pits, an outdoor kitchen, and a pool stretched toward the tree line. The previous survey was outdated, she announced loudly for nearby guests. The HOA resolved some old boundary issues. Progress requires flexibility. I nodded, saying nothing, which seemed to annoy her more than any argument would have. Richard Hammond approached with 2 glasses of champagne. Glad you could make it. Perhaps this means we can put unpleasantness behind us. Actually, I've made an interesting investment recently. Oh, his tone was dismissive, already looking past me to more important guests. I now own the electrical easement rights to Maple Ridge Heights. His champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. That's a ridiculous claim. Check the county records, I replied calmly. And while you're at it, review the accurate property lines again. The ones from my new survey. A small circle of guests had formed around us, sensing conflict. You can't just buy utility rights, Karen interjected, her voice rising. That's not how things work. It's exactly how they work when my grandfather included a right of first refusal clause that your lawyers missed. Richard pulled Karen aside, whispering urgently. Her face flushed with anger. When they returned, Karen's husband Michael joined them, his hand gripping Karen's elbow tightly. Whatever scheme you're planning won't work, Karen hissed, keeping her voice down for the guests. We run this community. The board votes how we tell them to vote. Did you tell them you built your house on stolen land? I asked, still calm. Michael stepped forward. You should leave. I agree. I placed my untouched champagne on a nearby table. I have a meeting with the power company tomorrow morning. Apparently there are some urgent maintenance issues that need addressing in this area. As I walked toward the door, I heard Karen's forced laugh. Some people can't accept progress. But I also noticed several guests watching me with curious expressions, including Eleanor Winters, who had lived in Maple Ridge Heights longer than anyone. Our eyes met briefly, and she gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. Outside, the night air felt clean after the stuffiness of Karen's mansion. Lights blazed from every window, illuminating the garden paths and security features. So much electricity, I thought. So many things that needed power to function. My phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer. Documents finalized. We're ready when you are. I took one last look at the house built on my land and smiled for the first time in weeks. 7 courier trucks pulled up outside the Maple Ridge Heights HOA office at exactly 9 a.m. Monday. Each driver carried sealed legal documents to different recipients. One set for Karen and Michael, one for Richard Hammond, one for each HOA board member, one for their lawyer Marcus Delgado, and one for the HOA office itself. I watched from my car across the street as the HOA secretary signed for the package, her eyebrows rising as she read the first page. My phone rang immediately. It was my lawyer. "Delivery's complete," she said. "Are you sure about this timeline? 30 days is aggressive." "They built that house in 4 months," I replied. "They can remove it in 1. The formal notice was simple. They had 30 days to remove all structures from my property and restore the land to its natural state, or I would exercise my easement rights to perform necessary electrical maintenance, which would require disconnecting power to specific sections of Maple Ridge Heights indefinitely. My phone buzzed nonstop for the next hour. Calls from numbers I didn't recognize, angry text messages, even an email from Marcus Delgado marked "Urgent Settlement Offer." I ignored them all. At 2:17 p.m., Richard Hammond himself appeared at my door, his Bentley parked hastily on my gravel driveway. "This is completely unnecessary," he said, waving my notice. "We can work this out like reasonable people. I tried reasonable 3 months ago when I showed you the property lines," I replied, not inviting him in. "You chose to continue building. The HOA has called an emergency meeting tonight. You should be there. I'll bring my lawyer." The Maple Ridge Heights Community Center buzzed with more people than I'd ever seen there. Word had spread beyond the board members, and dozens of homeowners filled the seats. Karen and Michael sat in front, whispering furiously with Marcus Delgado. When Richard called the meeting to order, he tried to sound calm, but his voice shook slightly. "We're facing a challenging situation regarding property boundaries and utility access." Karen couldn't contain herself. She jumped up, pointing at me. "He's threatening to cut off our electricity. This is blackmail." My lawyer, Dana Mitchell, calmly replied from beside me, "No, this is property law. My client owns both the land and the electrical easement rights. We're being generous with the 30-day timeline." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Most residents were hearing about this for the first time. An older man stood up. "What exactly is going on with our electricity?" Dana explained the situation while I watched the board members' faces. Richard looked calculating, Karen furious, and the others increasingly worried. Marcus Delgado tried to regain control. "This dispute involves only one property line. It shouldn't concern the rest of the community." "Except it does," I said, standing for the first time. "Because your HOA president and vice president deliberately moved boundary markers on my property while I was overseas. They sold land that wasn't theirs to sell, and now they're hoping you'll all pressure me into letting them keep it." The room erupted. Eleanor Winters, who I'd noticed at Karen's party, approached the microphone. "I've lived here 20 years. Are you saying our HOA falsified property lines?" Richard quickly pulled Marcus and Karen into a corner. Their heated whispers carried across the room. Karen's face turned scarlet as Marcus appeared to deliver bad news. After the impromptu huddle, Richard approached me with a strained smile. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately?" The meeting was adjourned with promises of updates. Outside, Richard cornered me in the parking lot. "Let's be reasonable," he said, his friendly tone at odds with his tense expression. "What do you really want?" "My land restored to its original condition," I replied firmly. "That would bankrupt Karen," he argued. "That house cost over $700,000. Then perhaps she shouldn't have built on land that wasn't hers." Day by day, their tactics evolved. First came offers, a different parcel of land in exchange, cash settlements, even membership in their exclusive community. When those failed, threats followed. Marcus sent letters outlining years of potential litigation. Michael approached my boss at the local engineering firm, suggesting my personal problems might affect my work performance. By day 14, neighbors I'd never met began appearing at my cabin. Some pleaded about property values and community harmony. Others weren't so nice. "You have no idea who you're messing with?" said one man who arrived in a sports car, claiming to be Karen's cousin. "People who cross the Thompsons tend to regret it." I installed security cameras the next day. On day 17, Eleanor Winters brought me a homemade pie and an interesting story. "I've lived here since before Richard and Karen," she said, sitting on my porch. "This isn't the first time they've pulled something like this. The Jacobsons lost part of their backyard 5 years ago. Suddenly, it was common area. The Millers were forced to tear down their gazebo last year because it violated guidelines that were added after they built it. Why doesn't anyone stop them?" I asked. "Fear," she said simply. "And the fact that Richard's brother-in-law is a judge in the county court. But no one's ever challenged them quite like you're doing." On day 22, I received a call from my surveyor, sounding uncomfortable. "Someone from Maple Ridge Heights contacted me," he said. "Offered to pay triple my fee if I would reconsider my findings on your property line." Michael Thompson? He didn't give his name, but it was a man. Said there might be future opportunities if I helped resolve this situation. I thanked him for his honesty and added another piece to my growing file. Day 28 arrived with a certified letter from Marcus Delgado offering my full asking price for the disputed acre, 10 times what it was worth. "This is their last attempt," Dana advised. "They don't believe you'll actually cut the power." That evening, a local news van parked outside my cabin. A reporter approached, microphone in hand. "We're doing a story on property disputes in developing areas," she explained. "Richard Hammond suggested we talk to you about a misunderstanding?" I smiled. "I'd be happy to show you the original property markers, the new survey, and the documents showing how they moved the line while I was overseas." Her eyes widened. "That wasn't the angle Mr. Hammond described." "I'm sure it wasn't." On day 29, Richard himself appeared at my door again, this time without the Bentley or the confident smile. "You've made your point," he said wearily. "What will it take to end this?" "Exactly what my notice said. Remove the structures from my land. Be realistic. We can't tear down a house in one day. You've had 29 days to start," I replied. "I haven't seen a single moving truck." He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking older. "Listen, we've contacted the utility company. They say they can't cut power based on your request. You need maintenance permits, work orders. This bluff won't work." I handed him a folder. Inside were copies of all the paperwork, approved permits for electrical maintenance, scheduled work orders, and the signed authorization from the county inspector. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," I said, "unless I see bulldozers on that property at dawn." He took the folder, hands shaking slightly. "You would really do this? Affect innocent families?" "Only 5 houses are in that grid section," I replied. "Yours, Karen's, and 3 others. I made sure of that. The rest of the community won't be touched." As he walked back to his car, I noticed a group of residents gathered at the edge of my property, watching. Karen wasn't among them, but Eleanor Winters was, along with several others I recognized from the community meeting. My phone buzzed with a text from Dana. "They're calling an emergency board vote tonight. Sources say they're split on what to do." I watched the sun setting behind the trees that remained on my property. Tomorrow would bring either bulldozers or darkness. They had to choose. My phone buzzed at exactly 9 a.m. "Are you sure about this?" asked Julio, my contact at the power company. "They had 30 days, I replied, looking at the calendar where I'd crossed off each passing day. "They chose this. All right then. Maintenance crew is starting now." I stood on my porch watching the distant houses of Maple Ridge Heights. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, one by one, lights flickered and died across the northeast section. 5 houses went dark. Karen's dream mansion built on my stolen land and 4 others, including Richard's sprawling colonial. My phone exploded with texts within minutes. First from Richard, "This is unacceptable." Then from their lawyer, "Cease this action immediately or face legal consequences." I didn't answer any of them. By 10:30 a.m., 3 news vans had parked at the Maple Ridge entrance. A reporter named Tanya Winters tried approaching Karen's house, but security guards turned her away. She found her way to my cabin instead. "Are you the property owner who's in a dispute with Maple Ridge HOA?" she asked, microphone extended. "I am," I replied calmly. "Would you like to see the original property markers and the new survey confirming they built on my land?" The camera rolled as I showed her grandfather's deed, the surveys, and the easement rights documentation. I gave them 30 days to acknowledge their mistake and begin removing the structure. They ignored me. "And now you've cut their power?" she asked. "Not exactly. As the easement rights owner, I've authorized necessary maintenance that requires temporary service interruption. How long that maintenance takes depends entirely on when the HOA decides to respect property boundaries." By noon, Richard's wife was pounding on my door, her perfectly highlighted hair now frizzed from stress and summer heat. "This is cruel," she screamed. "Our refrigerator is filled with food for the charity gala. Everything is spoiling." I remained calm. "I understand that's frustrating. There are several hotels nearby with generator backup. Or perhaps the unaffected Maple Ridge residents might help store your perishables." "You don't understand who you're dealing with," she hissed. "Richard has connections with the mayor, with judges, and I have the law on my side," I replied, "plus easement rights and very clear property boundaries." She left, tires spitting gravel from my driveway. By 2 p.m., Karen herself appeared, accompanied by 2 men I'd never seen before. One wore an expensive suit despite the heat. The other looked like private security. "You need to turn our power back on right now," Karen demanded. "Todd here is a city council member. He can make your life very difficult." The man in the suit nodded. "This dispute can be resolved without such extreme measures." "I agree completely," I said. "That's why I gave you 30 days to start removing the house from my property. You chose to ignore that reasonable time frame." "We can't just tear down a house," Karen shouted. "Yet you could build one on land that wasn't yours," I noted. "Interesting where you draw the line." The security-looking man stepped forward. "Maybe we should discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss that can't be said in front of the news cameras at the end of my driveway," I replied, gesturing to where 2 more news vans had joined the first. They left without further threats. As evening approached, my lawyer called. "They've filed an emergency injunction to restore power. Judge Whitaker denied it after seeing our documentation. They're getting desperate." Shadows lengthened as I sat on my porch swing, watching lightning bugs rise from the grass. In the distance, Karen's dark mansion loomed against the sunset sky. For the first time in months, I heard nothing but crickets and distant frogs. No construction noise, no gardening equipment, no blasting music from pool parties. Social media exploded as news spread. Residents from other sections of Maple Ridge began posting angry comments about their HOA leadership. Some even shared stories of other questionable actions by Richard and Karen over the years. Approved renovations mysteriously denied, selective enforcement of rules, special exceptions for board members. Just after midnight, security lights powered by emergency generators illuminated Karen's driveway as 3 cars pulled up. Through my binoculars, I watched Richard, Karen, and several board members having a heated argument outside. By dawn, my email inbox contained a message from Richard. "Emergency board meeting, 7 a.m., to discuss resolution. Your presence requested." I forwarded it to my lawyer, who arrived at my cabin by 6:30 with fresh coffee and a determined smile. "Ready to negotiate from a position of strength?" "Absolutely," I replied, "but I'm not backing down on the main point." At 7 a.m. sharp, we drove to the Maple Ridge Community Center. The parking lot was packed, not just with board members' vehicles, but with dozens of residents who'd somehow learned about the meeting. Inside, the room hummed with tension. Richard sat at the head table, looking like he hadn't slept. Karen was nowhere to be seen. An older woman with silver hair and piercing eyes stood up from the audience as I entered. "I'm Eleanor Winters," she announced. "I've lived in Maple Ridge for 20 years, and I had no idea what they'd done to your property." None of us did. Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Richard cleared his throat and glanced at the other board members before looking at me with defeat in his eyes. "We're prepared to discuss terms," he said. But were they truly ready to give up their dream house? Or was this just another delay tactic? And where was Karen? The real battle was just beginning. "We expect the power to be restored immediately as a show of good faith," demanded Marcus Delgado, the HOA lawyer, his voice echoing in the packed community center. I exchanged glances with my attorney, who gave a slight shake of her head. "The power stays off until we have a signed agreement," I stated firmly. "I've learned not to trust verbal promises from this board." The crowd murmured. Many residents had brought battery-powered fans to combat the stuffy heat in the powerless building. Eleanor Winters stood up again. "Where's Karen? She should be part of this discussion." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Karen is handling some personal matters." "You mean she's packing her things?" called out a resident from the back. "My cousin works for the moving company she hired this morning." The room erupted in chaos. My lawyer raised her hand for silence. "Here are our terms," she announced, sliding documents across the table. "First, the house on my client's property will be removed within 60 days. Second, the HOA will cover all costs of removal. Third, the property line will be restored and permanently marked. Fourth, compensation for the trees removed and the harassment my client endured." Richard scanned the papers, his face growing pale. "This would bankrupt the HOA reserve fund. Perhaps you should have considered that before stealing land," replied a woman seated near Eleanor. To my surprise, it was Richard's wife who spoke next. "We should accept these terms," she said quietly. "This has gone far enough." Marcus Delgado huddled with the board members, whispering urgently. Richard kept shaking his head. Eleanor approached the main table. "I'd like to propose an alternative solution," she said. "One that might work better for everyone." All eyes turned to her. "The HOA buys the house from Karen at cost," she explained. "We then carefully dismantle it, not demolish it, and repurpose the materials for the community center expansion we've been planning. The costs come partially from our reserve fund and partially from a special assessment on board members who approved this illegal construction." Richard started to protest, but Eleanor continued. "Karen gets most of her investment back. The homeowner gets his land restored. The community gets building materials we desperately need. And those responsible face consequences without bankrupting our entire neighborhood." My lawyer leaned close to me. "It's actually not a bad solution. What do you think?" I considered it carefully. "I could agree to this with 3 conditions. First, I want this agreement signed today and the dismantling to begin immediately. Second, I want the property line restored with permanent markers that cannot be moved. And third, I want a public apology." The negotiations lasted for hours. Outside, news crews waited for the outcome. My phone buzzed with a text from Julio at the power company. Pressures mounting from city officials to restore service. "How much longer?" "Not much," I texted back. "Hold firm." Finally, around 2 p.m., we had a signed agreement. I called Julio immediately to restore power, which came back on with cheers from the crowd outside. The agreement included everything I'd asked for, plus something unexpected: Richard's resignation as HOA president, effective immediately. Eleanor was nominated as interim president until proper elections could be held. I watched from my cabin over the next few days as work crews began the careful process of dismantling Karen's dream house. Rather than destroying it, they methodically labeled each piece, cataloging materials for reuse. Windows would go to the community center, kitchen cabinets to the pool house renovation, hardwood floors to repair the clubhouse. 1 week into the dismantling process, a sleek black car pulled up to my cabin. Karen stepped out alone, looking somehow smaller without her usual entourage. "May I come in?" she asked. When I hesitated, she added, I'm not here to fight. We sat on my porch with untouched glasses of lemonade between us. They're making Michael and me pay back the difference between what the HOA gave us for the house and what it actually cost to build, she said finally. We have to sell our other properties to cover it. I didn't offer sympathy. I wanted to know why, she continued. You could have settled for money. Why insist on tearing down the house? I considered my answer carefully. That land was my grandfather's. He taught me that we don't own the earth, we're just borrowing it for a while. When you cut down those 100-year-old trees to build your house, you didn't just take my property. You took something that wasn't yours to take from future generations. She stared at her untouched lemonade. The board told me the land had always been part of Maple Ridge. I never checked the records myself. Convenient ignorance is still a choice, I replied. Karen left soon after. I heard they moved to Arizona eventually. 3 months later, the last traces of the house were gone. The HOA hired a team of landscapers specializing in native restoration to replant trees where the foundation had been. Eleanor, now officially elected as HOA president, invited me to the planting ceremony. We're establishing a conservation easement for this border area, she explained as we watched volunteers digging holes for saplings. It can never be developed, even if property changes hands. I sold the electrical easement rights back to the community at cost, with one binding condition: a percentage of all future HOA fees would go toward local land conservation. Richard appeared at the ceremony briefly, looking humbled. He approached me while I was examining the new property markers. Solid granite posts sunk 5 feet into the ground. I misjudged you, he admitted. I thought you were just a troublemaker we could intimidate or outlast. Most bullies make that mistake, I replied. The media attention eventually faded. My story became a case study in property law classes at the state university. Twice a year, students would visit to see the restored boundary and learn about easement rights. 5 years later, I built a small viewing platform in the trees overlooking where Karen's house had once stood. From there, I could see the young forest beginning to reclaim the space. Oak and maple saplings now reaching 10 feet tall, wildflowers carpeting the ground each spring. Sometimes I bring my nephew up there and tell him the story. Not about winning or revenge, but about standing your ground when it matters. The best part? I tell him, watching birds flit between the growing trees, isn't that I got my land back. It's that something better took its place. My grandfather would have understood perfectly. The land remembers what we do to it, both the harm and the healing.